There is a warning that appears in ancient Jewish households, in old Chinese merchant families, in Vedic teachings, and in the quiet codes of Mediterranean trading clans. It sounds simple. Guard what you have by guarding what you say about it, not as superstition, not as paranoia, as a principle that survived centuries because the people who ignored it kept experiencing the same thing. Prosperity that arrived, then quietly retreated without obvious explanation. 3 specific revelations. 3 things, spoken casually, openly, without a second thought, that ancient traditions across the world identified as some of the most reliable ways to push wealth away. Most people reveal all 3, regularly, to people they trust, in conversations they consider harmless. The old teachings disagreed. In Kabbalistic tradition, the spoken word was never considered neutral when it came to money. In ancient Chinese merchant culture, there were things a prosperous family simply did not say out loud, not to neighbors, not to relatives, sometimes not even within the household walls. In Vedic philosophy, the energy around what is growing was treated as fragile in a very specific way, fragile to attention, to declaration, to premature exposure. Different languages, different centuries, different parts of the world, the same warning. What follows is not about becoming secretive or cold. It's about understanding something that quietly separates the people who build lasting prosperity from the ones who seem to be always on the edge of it, always working, always moving, but never quite arriving. 3 things. Never reveal them. Of the 3, this is the one most people dismiss immediately. I don't go around telling people my net worth. That is usually the first response, and it is almost always followed by a conversation that does exactly that, not in numbers perhaps, but in the details that make numbers unnecessary. The new car mentioned casually, the renovation described in more detail than needed, the salary shared in a moment of pride or comparison or misplaced intimacy, the savings referenced to reassure someone or to establish credibility, or simply because the question was asked and silence felt rude. The old teachings were not concerned with the dramatic disclosure. They were concerned with the ordinary one. In the Talmudic tradition, there is a principle that has shaped the financial behavior of Jewish families across centuries of displacement, persecution, and survival in hostile environments. The principle emerges from a passage in Tractate Ta'anit, and its message is precise. Blessing does not rest on something that has been counted and exposed. This was not interpreted as a mystical warning about numbers. It was understood as something deeply practical, an observation about what happens to prosperity when it becomes visible, when it is named, when it is placed in front of eyes that have not been invited to see it. The concept of ayin hara, often translated as the evil eye, is frequently reduced to folk superstition by those who encounter it without context. Within the tradition itself, the teaching was never primarily about curses cast by enemies. It was about something quieter and more universal. It was about the weight of other people's awareness. When what you have becomes known, when the approximate size of your wealth, your savings, your income, your assets enters the consciousness of the people around you, something shifts in the social and psychological environment you move through every day. People begin to relate to you differently, some with envy they would never acknowledge, some with expectations that quietly accumulate, some with a revised calculation of what you owe, what you should give, what is reasonable to ask of you, some with a subtle resentment they cannot explain and would deny if confronted. None of this is dramatic, none of it announces itself. It arrives as a changed atmosphere, a slight shift in the texture of your relationships, a new weight in certain conversations. A sense that what you have is no longer entirely yours, that it now exists in relation to what others know about it. The ancient Chinese merchant families of the Song and Ming dynasties operated under a cultural code that treated the public knowledge of one's wealth as a form of vulnerability. The world was full of thieves, certainly, but the deeper concern was different. Visible prosperity attracted forces that invisible prosperity did not. Obligation, expectation, interference. The quiet hostility of those who measure their own lives against yours and find the comparison unfavorable. Prosperous families kept their financial life behind a particular kind of silence, not the silence of poverty, the silence of protection. The difference between the two was understood clearly by those who had learned it, and almost never by those who hadn't. When people know what you have, they begin, unconsciously, automatically, to factor that knowledge into how they treat you, into what they ask, into what they assume you can absorb, into what they feel entitled to expect. And you, absorbing all of this, begin to make decisions not from your own financial clarity, but from a complex web of other people's awareness. You spend to manage impressions. You give to manage relationships. You hold back in ways that cost you, or move forward in ways that don't serve you. All because what you have is no longer private. It is social. It exists in the minds of others, as much as in your own account. The old families understood that wealth preserved in silence stayed wealth. Wealth performed, announced, or carelessly revealed had a way of finding its level, pulled down not by misfortune, but by the 1,000 invisible forces that activate the moment other people know what you have. This is not about becoming closed or cold. It is not about hiding your prosperity from those who love you or living in a posture of permanent concealment. It is about discernment, about understanding that the question, "How much do you have?" is almost never as innocent as it sounds, and that the answer, once given, cannot be taken back. In many old households, there was a simple practice around this. When a family member was asked directly about money, about savings, income, assets, or financial position, the response was trained to be warm but unrevealing. Enough to be comfortable, enough to keep moving, enough, thank God, not evasive, not cold, simply protected, a boundary held with grace rather than with walls. The people who practiced this were not paranoid. They were not distrustful of everyone around them. They simply understood something that took most people decades to learn, if they learned it at all. Prosperity protected in silence tends to grow. Prosperity displayed tends to generate forces that work quietly against it. The old teachers did not consider this unfair. They considered it the nature of things, and they built their financial lives accordingly. This one is harder to guard, because it doesn't come from pride, it comes from pain. When someone is struggling financially, when the pressure is real, when the anxiety is present, when the gap between where they are and where they need to be feels wide, the impulse to speak about it is powerful, almost physical. The weight of carrying it alone feels heavier than the situation itself, so people talk. To friends, to family, to colleagues who ask how things are going, sometimes to near strangers in moments of unexpected honesty. They describe the debt. They explain the shortfall. They map out the problem in detail, sometimes with more precision than they would ever apply to their goals or their strengths. The old teachings looked at this pattern with great concern. In Vedic philosophy, the concept of Vakshakti, the power of the spoken word, was not treated as metaphor. It was treated as mechanism. The idea was precise. What you give voice to, you give energy to, and what you give energy to, you strengthen. This was not interpreted as a reason to deny difficulty. Denial was never the teaching. It was a reason to be exceptionally careful about the difference between speaking to process and speaking to broadcast, between sharing with someone who has the wisdom and the capacity to hold your situation carefully, and speaking openly, repeatedly, casually, to anyone willing to listen. The first was considered necessary, sometimes even healing. The second was considered dangerous. In old Japanese household culture, there existed a practice around financial difficulty that those outside the tradition might read as excessive restraint. Families facing hardship maintained a deliberate silence about the specifics of their situation, not just in public, but carefully within the household itself. The reasoning was not shame. Though shame was part of the cultural texture, the deeper reasoning was energetic and practical. Words spoken about lack were believed to settle into the space they were spoken in, to take up residence. A household where financial wounds were regularly named aloud, where debt was discussed at the dinner table, where shortfalls were rehearsed in conversation after conversation, was considered a household where those conditions were being continuously reinforced, not by fate, by the daily repeated act of making scarcity the dominant language of the home. Whether you approach this as symbolism or as observation, the pattern holds. There is something that happens when financial difficulty becomes the central narrative of a household. When it is spoken about so often, in such detail, with such emotional weight, that it begins to feel less like a temporary condition and more like an identity. You stop being someone navigating a difficult season. You become someone who is in financial trouble. And that shift from temporary condition to settled identity changes things that are very difficult to change back. It changes how you present yourself, how you evaluate opportunities, what you believe is available to you, what risks you feel entitled to take, what futures feel realistic, what version of yourself you carry into every room, every conversation, every decision. The Sufi tradition held a teaching about this that is worth sitting with carefully. The elder teachers spoke of what they called the rehearsal of wounds, the habit of returning again and again to the spoken description of one's suffering, not to move through it, but to inhabit it, to make it familiar, to build a kind of home inside it. They taught that the rehearsal of a wound is not the same as the healing of it, and that some people, without realizing it, become so practiced at describing their financial pain that the description itself becomes an obstacle to the change they say they want. This is not a moral judgment. It is an observation about the relationship between language and reality that appears across traditions separated by continents, by centuries, by entirely different frameworks for understanding the world. The consistency is worth noticing. There is also a social dimension that the old teachings addressed with particular precision. When you reveal your financial wounds to the wrong people, and the wrong people are far more common than most care to admit, you receive something in return that you did not ask for and cannot easily refuse: their conclusions about you. Some will offer sympathy that quietly carries a revised assessment of your capability. Some will feel a relief they would never admit, a settling of the comparison they make between your life and theirs. Some will file the information away and retrieve it later, in contexts you cannot predict or control. None of this is malicious necessarily. It is simply human, and the old families who understood it were not cynical about human nature. They were clear-eyed about it. Clarity is not the same as cynicism. They understood that your financial wounds, once shared, do not disappear from the minds that received them. They live there. They shape how those people see you, how they speak about you to others, what they believe is possible for you, what they expect from you. And you, moving through a world where your wounds are known, carry an invisible weight that has nothing to do with your actual financial situation, and everything to do with the story other people are now holding about you. Only with those who have the wisdom to hold it without filing it, the strength to hear it without being diminished by it, and the genuine care to want something better for you rather than simply confirming what they already suspected. Those people exist. They are rare, and they deserve the truth about where you are. Everyone else deserves something simpler, something that offers no foothold for their conclusions. Things are moving. It is a process. I am working through it. Not a lie, not a performance, a protection. The wound you stop rehearsing in public has a better chance of closing. The difficulty you stop making into a daily broadcast has a better chance of remaining temporary, of staying a season rather than becoming a permanent address. Sharing everything is not always strength. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do for their financial life is to hold its difficulties with enough dignity and restraint that they do not become the story other people tell about them, or the story they tell about themselves. This is the one that catches ambitious people, not the careless ones, not the ones who speak without thinking, the driven ones. The ones who are building something, planning something, moving towards something with genuine intention and real energy behind it. They are the ones most likely to make this mistake, because the impulse to share a plan does not usually come from vanity. It comes from excitement, from the very real feeling that something is about to change, that a door is opening, that the work is finally about to produce what it was always supposed to produce. And in that moment of charged anticipation, the most natural thing in the world is to tell someone. The old teaching said, don't, not yet, not until the move is complete, not until what was potential has become actual, not until the flame has enough heat to survive the wind. In Kabbalistic tradition, there is a teaching about the space between intention and manifestation, the fragile interval where something exists as a seed but has not yet become a plant. This space was treated with great care. The sages taught that premature disclosure during this interval was one of the most reliable ways to interrupt what was being built. They called it speaking before the time, and they considered it a form of carelessness that prosperity did not forgive easily. The Sufi masters approached the same idea from a different direction. In certain orders, a student who spoke openly about a spiritual undertaking before it was complete was understood to have weakened it, not through any supernatural mechanism, but through a very human one. When you announce what you are about to do, something shifts in your relationship with the doing of it. The announcement itself provides a release, a small but real satisfaction. The acknowledgement of the plan delivers a portion of the reward that was meant to come only from the execution. And that portion, once received prematurely, quietly reduces the drive that was fueling the movement forward. The old teachers watched this happen across generations and encoded the warning accordingly. They needed no external confirmation. The pattern repeated itself with enough consistency to become teaching. There is something else, something that operates not inside you but around you. When you reveal your next financial move, the investment you are considering, the business you are about to launch, the opportunity you are preparing to act on, the negotiation you are entering, you place that move inside other people's minds before it has had time to become real. And other people's minds are not neutral environments. In old Mediterranean trading families, there was a practice so embedded in the culture that it required no explanation among those who understood it. A merchant preparing a significant move told no one outside the innermost circle of those whose interests were completely aligned with his own. He was not primarily concerned with direct sabotage, though that was always a possibility. He kept silent because he understood what happened to plans that were known before they were executed. People who knew offered opinions. The opinions introduced doubt. The doubt created hesitation. The hesitation created delays. The delays created openings for circumstances to change. And what had been a clear, energized movement forward became a clouded, questioned, second-guessed process that no longer carried the same force it had when it lived only in his own mind. This pattern does not require enemies to unfold. The people who slow you down are usually the people who care about you. Their concern is genuine. Their caution is offered with love. Their questions are reasonable and their doubts are well-intentioned. And none of that changes the effect. A plan examined by too many people before it is ready to be examined loses something. The old families knew this, and so they waited. They waited until the contract was signed to mention the negotiation, until the business was open to mention the idea, until the investment had returned to announce the entry, until what was potential had become solid enough to withstand the weight of being known. In Japanese merchant culture, this discipline had almost a ceremonial quality. The planning of a significant financial move was considered a private act, held within the household, sometimes within a single person, until the moment of completion made disclosure not just acceptable, but natural. There is a phrase that appears in various forms across several of these traditions, and it carries the essential teaching in its simplest form. Show the fruit, never show the seed. The seed requires particular conditions to become what it is meant to become: darkness, pressure, quiet, time undisturbed by examination. Place it in public view too early. Subject it to the full weight of other people's opinions, doubts, questions, and conclusions before it has had time to root, and you alter those conditions in ways that cannot always be corrected. This is why the people who speak most about what they are going to do are so often the ones who do the least of it, and why the ones who say almost nothing, who move in a kind of productive silence, revealing the plan only once it is already complete, tend to build things that last. It is not coincidence. It is the oldest pattern in the teachings of prosperity. When the impulse arrives to share a financial plan, to announce the move, describe the strategy, reveal the opportunity, pause, hold it for a moment, and ask, is this complete enough to survive being known? If the answer is yes, speak freely. If the answer is anything less than yes, wait, not out of fear, out of respect for what is still becoming, the move that no one knew about until it was done, the investment revealed only after it had returned, the business announced only when the doors were already open. These carry a different quality. Silence is not magic. It is protection. And the things worth building deserve exactly that. The protection of not being known until they are ready to be seen. 3 things. That is all. 3 categories of disclosure. Ordinary, common, almost universal, that ancient traditions across the world identified as quiet but consistent drains on prosperity. What you have, what hurts you, what you're about to do. Most people reveal all 3 without hesitation. In casual conversation, in moments of pride or pain, in the excitement of a plan that feels too good to keep inside. They reveal them to people who mean well and people who don't. To those who have the wisdom to hold the information carefully, and to those who absolutely do not. And then they wonder why things feel slower than they should. Why what seemed close keeps receding. Why the momentum that was building quietly lost its force somewhere between the intention and the arrival. The ancient teachers would not have wondered. They would have recognized the pattern immediately. Across Jewish households that preserved wealth through centuries of displacement, across Chinese merchant families that built fortunes in environments that could turn hostile without warning, across Vedic teachings that treated the spoken word as a force with real consequence, across Japanese cultural codes where financial discipline and social restraint were considered inseparable, across Sufi orders, where the relationship between speech and outcome was studied with the same seriousness applied to prayer, the same observation, the same warning, the same quiet rule. Prosperity is not only built, it is guarded, and the guarding begins not with what you do with your money, but with what you say about it. Accumulation without protection is a slow leak. You can earn steadily and lose steadily at the same time. You can build with one hand and dismantle with the other, without ever making a bad investment, without ever trusting the wrong person with your money, simply by trusting the wrong people with your words. The leak is invisible. It leaves no obvious trace. It works through atmosphere, through the weight of other people's awareness, through the gradual erosion of the private space that prosperity requires to grow undisturbed. And it works slowly enough that most people never connect the cause to the effect. They look at the result, the stagnation, the receding, the sense of always moving but never quite arriving. And they search for explanations in the visible world, in the economy, in timing, in luck that seems to favor others. The old teachings would redirect that search. Look first at what you have said, to whom, about what, at what stage of its becoming. That is where the answer usually lives. What has been shared here is not about becoming a closed person, not about moving through life trusting no one, sharing nothing, building walls where relationships should be. The traditions that carried these teachings were not populated by cold or isolated people. They were populated by those who understood the difference between intimacy and exposure, between the inner circle that deserves the truth and the outer world that deserves only what is already solid enough to survive being known. That distinction, knowing who belongs in which circle and what belongs in which conversation, was considered one of the foundational disciplines of a prosperous life. Not strategy, not financial knowledge, discernment. The ability to sit with something valuable, a plan, a wound, a number, a possibility, and ask before speaking, does this serve what I am building, or does it cost something I cannot afford to lose? The people who carried that question with them across generations built things that lasted. The ones who didn't, who confused openness with wisdom, who mistook disclosure for connection, often found themselves building and rebuilding the same foundations, wondering why the structure never seemed to hold. The warning is old. The pattern it describes is not. It is happening now, in conversations that feel harmless, in moments that seem insignificant, in disclosures that cost nothing in the moment and quietly cost everything over time. You have heard the warning. What is done with it belongs entirely to you. The traditions carried in these teachings did not treat silence as coldness. They treated it as reverence. Reverence for what is still growing. Reverence for what has not yet arrived. Reverence for the quiet, unhurried process by which real prosperity, the kind that compounds, the kind that survives difficulty, the kind that passes from one generation to the next, actually builds itself. What you protect, you preserve. This is the oldest principle in the room, older than any strategy, older than any framework, carried quietly across centuries by families who understood that the first guardian of their prosperity was not a bank, not a locked door, not a written agreement. It was their own mouth. If what was shared here reached you, not as new information, but as recognition of something you already carried without words for it, then there is one thing worth doing. Go to the words below this teaching. Leave only this: my prosperity is mine to protect, not as performance, as a quiet mark left by someone who has heard the warning and chosen without announcement to live differently because of it. Let it be found by the next person who arrives here still searching. Some knowledge once received cannot be unreceived. You have it now.